Ah, the 18th century. Aristocrats in wigs taking snuff. Dances in posh houses. Well, not necessarily. The 1700s were exciting times, scientific times. New knowledge in physics, chemistry, anatomy, botany, mathematics and mechanics. Ideas and inventions.
It was so different to anything else that had gone before.
Dandies and dealmakers. He's here somewhere. Art and amputations.
It was a very free-thinking place. Was it dangerous? A little bit, probably.
Welcome to Birmingham in the 18th century. Birmingham in the 21st century. A veritable hive of industry, not that different from the 18th. I'm on the trail of three different people who used their curiosity and ingenuity to develop their skills. They were craftsman scientists.
John Baskerville, artist and printer. Josiah Wedgwood, potter and social campaigner. Robert Miners, surgeon and innovator. I'm fascinated to find out how these three men, in their own ways, changed their worlds. Their intriguing stories can be told through art still with us today.
In the 1700s, the place was alive with ideas. Birmingham was a free city, no secretive guilds, no single dominant industry, no ruling aristocrats, no bishop. Nobody, in fact, to stop you being curious, stop you experimenting, stop you changing the way things were done.
Birmingham at that time was expanding fast. In 1700, the population was around 15,000. By 1800, it was over 70,000. In the 1730s, an engraver called John Baskerville was working in Birmingham. Caroline Archer of Birmingham City University has researched his life and work.
So, what was Baskerville's talent?
He started off as a master teacher of handwriting. He himself says he has a lifelong love of letters. When he came to Birmingham in about 1727, he opened up a school round about the Bull Ring, where he was offering teaching as a writing master. The evidence that we have for that is a slate that now hangs in the Library of Birmingham. This is a very good reproduction. He's talking about gravestones cut in many of the hands by John Baskerville, writing master. So it shows he has two skills on offer here.
It looks like a Roman kind of inscription. It's really precise. But it also looks a bit like a medieval manuscript. It's very elaborate, isn't it?
Exactly. He starts off using an elaborated fracture up here. He moves into a quite capable upper and lower case. Then we have an English round hand. Then we have a compressed English black letter, and then he moves into an italic uppercase, which looks like copperplate script.
So he's showing off.
He's showing off. It shows that he has educated himself beyond that of a simple writing master.
It's very desirable, is the only way I can put it. You want to touch it, don't you?
Exactly. It's very, and you should do. It is very tactile. You can sort of put your fingers inside Baskerville's lettering.
It's right.
Yes, exactly.
Baskerville next saw an opportunity to grasp a new business, the manufacture of decorative items known as Japanware. Made of painted and varnished papier-mâché, or tin, these items became the height of fashion. And there's a collection of them at Birmingham Museum and Art Gallery.
So this is treasure, isn't it? These would have been objects of desire.
Yeah, Japanware is a kind of name that refers to the type of varnish that was invented. It attempted to mimic Eastern decorative arts,
Right.
sort of from China and Japan and India. Baskerville focused particularly on Japanning of tinware, and he was one of the first people in Birmingham to really start experimenting with Japanning varnishes.
Did they feel that they were making art?
Definitely. I mean, particularly this tray here is made by Henry Clay in, I think, about the 1790s. He had some quite sort of high-end clients that he was making material for.
Do you have any Baskerville Japanware?
Well, unfortunately, we don't actually know of any Japanware that's attributed to Baskerville. He didn't mark his work, which was very common.
But there is an item of Japanware with Baskerville's image on it.
It's very picky-upable as well.
This snuff box here is, we reckon, about 1820s. We know this because the artist Samuel Raven painted this depiction of John Baskerville.
So he was a
on the
celebrity at this point.
Yeah, he was.
So somebody is making something desirable and fashionable with a picture of a local hero on there.
There are a number of accounts of people who visited Baskerville's workshop and home, because his workshop and home was kind of in the same place, and kind of went through the factory and looked at all the different stages of production, and then you could buy your souvenir maybe at the end. This one actually finishes kind of remained
It looks
pretty
new.
pristine. It does look new, doesn't it?
It really does. I'm wearing gloves, of course, to protect this, but don't forget that everybody in the 18th century would have worn gloves as a matter of course anyway, except when they were taking snuff.
The image of Baskerville is inspired by an earlier portrait of the great man. It's in the storeroom of Birmingham Museum and Art Gallery.
He's here somewhere. There he is. A figure of substance. Very determined set to the mouth there. Doesn't look very pleased. Looks as though he thinks that the portraitist is wasting his time. Looks like a velvet coat. And a velvet chair. So he's made a few bob.
And he used that wealth to create an estate and push forward into the next chapter of his work, back to words, but this time the printed word.
He loved the technology of his day, and he was able to marry the technology of the day, which was printing, with his love for letters.
Are these books from his press?
These books are from Baskerville's press
Can I
in
have a look?
Birmingham. Push cam.
That comes to the hand, as we say.
It's just what Baskerville will call a small performance. He refers to all his works as performances.
Oh, did he? It is very, very clear.
Baskerville applied his attention to all aspects of it.
When he produced his first books, what did people think?
The connoisseurs loved it. It was so different to anything else. Baskerville believed the beauty of letters should shine through. Other people hated it because they felt Baskerville's type made you blind. He increased the contrast between thick and thin strokes in the letter form, and his detractors felt that dazzled the eyes and made it illegible. Baskerville is what we call the complete printer. So you had to look at the printing press, you had to look at the inks, you had to look at the paper, you had to look at how you manufactured your type, and you had to get all that right to be able to produce a beautiful book. And he was the first one to do that.
Baskerville was clearly an innovator and a flamboyant character.
There are many stories about Baskerville riding around Birmingham in a coach drawn by cream-coloured horses, and the coach itself assembled panels made from his Japanware. So I think he's certainly cut a figure.
So he was a designer, craftsman, printer.
Designer, craftsman, printer, thinker, businessman.
Baskerville's typeface is still used a lot and loved today. This is a series of posters by the students at the School of Visual Communications at Birmingham City University. Typefaces do have a personality, don't they? Because it's the way people choose them on their computer now. People are very particular. And his typeface has great personality, but what exactly is he doing here?
Well, I think you can see here a throwback to the slate that we saw earlier and Baskerville's handwriting. You can see the influence of a broad nib pen, and you can feel
Like
the
an
pen.
Italian.
Exactly, you can feel the movement there.
Yes, it does flow, doesn't it?
And this is what we call a spot character. Every typeface has one or two characters that make it very different to other types. And with Baskerville, it's this opening here. He never closes that G up. He lets it stay open. Very characteristic of Baskerville.
Looks like it could bounce.
The Baskerville typeface is still one of the world's most popular. There's almost certainly a version of it on your computer.
Would he have approved?
Oh, yes, I'm sure. You know, he loved technology, so seeing his typeface now reinterpreted for the digital age, I think he would be delighted.
In 1775, John Baskerville died, and his instructions specified that he was to be buried in his own unconsecrated land. But the story doesn't end there. When the canal network was built in Birmingham, his body had to be moved. And it kept being buried and moved to various locations, including a shop where visitors could pay to see his body. It now rests at Warstone Lane Cemetery in Birmingham.
This is where he has been since the end of the 19th century.
He was as restless in death as he was in life.
Indeed.
So, he's in here, somewhere. How enigmatic. What talent, what drive, what energy. I would have liked to have met him. This is St Paul's Square, the only surviving Georgian square in Birmingham. Building started in 1777 and the houses were aimed at the middling classes. And very nice too.
It's an exhilarating and an exciting time. It's an adventurous time. People are coming up with new ideas. We need to look at that in the widest sense. We mustn't diminish the importance of other towns in the Midlands, the Stokes, Nottinghams, Derbys, Leicesters, Wolverhamptons, the smaller black country towns that are beginning to grow as well. But Birmingham became the centre because it was not only this place of diversity, it was growing rapidly.
Birmingham became known as the workshop of the world. This square was surrounded by industry. They made buttons, jewellery, buckles, nails, guns, swords, glass. The scientists and craftsmen of 18th century Birmingham were so excited by their experiments and inventions, they decided to form a society to share them. The Lunar Society, so called apparently because they met on the nights of the full moon when it was light to travel at night. They met here in Matthew Bolton's house, Soho House, next to the Soho Manufactory, where they manufactured steam engines. Like-minded scientists and craftsmen all met here convivially to enthuse about science. There's a real spirit of place here because this is the actual table that they would all have sat around.
Yes, this is certainly one of the original lunar tables. It was made about 1790, so the society had been going for 20 odd years by then. But, you know, there's no doubt that around this table in the 1790s, that many of the great minds of the Enlightenment would have sat and talked. And this whole room, if you like, it's historic, but in the 18th century, it's all about technology. Soho House had central heating, the first house to have central heating since Roman times, allegedly.
Did they challenge each other?
Yes, they did, I think, and they'd certainly argue long into the night.
Success was very important to them then.
It was. I mean, I think because success brought power. At the end of the 18th century, if you wanted to see the modern world, you came to Birmingham. It was a place of wonder. People from around the world would trot down the road to the Soho manufactory to see it because it was extraordinary. It was probably the first, modern factory in the world. Ambassadors, kings, queens, they would come and visit these places. They'd do a ruin in the morning, and in the afternoon they'd see technology. And again, there was no distinction, I think, which is it's a very modern idea that there's art and science. In the 18th century, there was no such division.
One of those lunar men who used brain and hand to discover and innovate was potter and businessman Josiah Wedgwood from Staffordshire, who'd begun throwing pots as a boy. These wonderful works of nature are too vast for my narrow microscopic comprehension, so I will bid them adieu for the present and attend to what better suits my capacity, the forming of a jug or a teapot. The Wedgwood Museum near Stoke-on-Trent has a large collection of pottery that tells his story.
He came from the third generation of potters. He was a superb potter, although he didn't or wasn't able to use the kick wheels because he had a severely disabled right knee due to smallpox when he was a child. And so he turned his attention to experimentation and changing, following fashion, providing the things that the consumer wanted.
But what he did have was exquisite taste.
Superb taste, but of course this was the time in England when neoclassicism was suddenly coming onto the radar of everybody. Great new houses were being built in the countryside, parks were being laid out by Capability Brown, and of course into those houses they wanted replicas of the classical antiquities that were being excavated at Herculaneum and Pompeii. These are black basalt, as Wedgwood calls it. This is a particular type of clay where water has seeped through the coal seams, taking with it the mineral elements, and that has permanently stained the clay beneath.
Wedgwood absolutely adored applying science to what he did, didn't he?
Oh, absolutely. And of course he was genuinely interested in all aspects of the scientific world.
And he kept meticulous records.
Aren't they stunning?
Yes.
In the 1780s, Wedgwood was active in the campaign to abolish the slave trade. He created a new and brilliant weapon.
This doesn't look much. Little badge, but it's very, very important. Tell me about it.
This is known as the slave medallion. Josiah Wedgwood had actually seen the horrors of the slave trade in either Liverpool or London. These were actually modelled originally in 1787, and he felt so passionate about how ghastly this entire trade was that he made these medallions and freely gave them to anybody who'd support the cause. You could argue that they're the first campaigning medal.
You could argue very forcibly.
What is fascinating is he didn't just distribute them to his friends and supporters in Great Britain, but even sent them to America to Benjamin Franklin, whom he'd met through the Lunar Society. And Benjamin Franklin writes that they've done far more for the cause than many thousands of words could ever do. Ladies had them made into hat pins or bracelets, and gentlemen wore them on their watch chains so that they could actually indicate their true support for the cause.
Am I not a man and a brother?
Which is the motto that goes round it. There was another one done which says, am I not a woman and a sister? But we see very, very few of those.
You just want to pick it up. It's beautifully detailed, beautifully detailed.
It was actually modelled in this low relief by his top modeller, a man called William Hackwood. And Hackwood was probably the most sensitive of the modellers, to be able to take something from a printed page and turn it into something that was so emotive.
It is indeed. Very emotive. It's very charged, isn't it?
Yes.
The anti-slave trade campaign required petitions to Parliament. It required the production of literature. But it also required a symbol. That logo we can see, I think, as the first modern logo for a contemporary pressure group.
Josiah Wedgwood's achievements were huge, in spite of his struggle with his painfully diseased right leg. In 1768, Wedgwood had no choice but to have it removed.
It is a horrible thought. In the 18th century, there was no antiseptic and no anaesthetic. Josiah was given a sedative, and incredibly, he asked to be propped up so that he could watch the operation on his right leg. Thankfully, Josiah Wedgwood survived the operation, and incredibly, he had his bandages removed only 5 days later. For the rest of his life, he used a wooden leg and continued to oversee the production of Wedgwood. In 1767, Birmingham's 24,000 inhabitants were tended by 20 surgeons and 3 university-trained doctors, physicians, plus unlicensed practitioners and people selling so-called cures, quacks.
But this man was no quack. Robert Miners.
Robert Miners is, I guess you could say, an ordinary provincial medical practitioner of the 18th century. He was a surgeon, not a physician, and the difference would have been that a physician went to university, and after a local education, he was sent by his family to undertake an apprenticeship, which the family paid £50 for. And after 7 years of training and gradually being introduced to each aspect that was part of a surgeon's practice, he went to Birmingham and he set himself up in practice there himself.
Soho House in Birmingham has an interesting painting of this medical man.
He would have had to have been very skilled, wouldn't he?
Yeah, I mean...
and that was about tools and about knives.
Yes, it was about speed and precision.
So who painted the portrait?
The portrait is by a Birmingham artist by the name of James Miller, who was actually a lodger with Miners.
While you're here.
So perhaps he got a discount. He was a well-regarded Birmingham artist. This is one of my favourite paintings by Miller. It's a very nice painting of what's called a conversation piece, which is a style of painting that particularly features in the 18th century and was very much liked by the new middle classes. And it shows Robert Miners and his family in a kind of stage set background.
They're all looking at us, aren't they?
They are, and conversation pieces are supposed to be relaxed and they reflect the sort of polite society. They reflect the sort of code of, you know, informality, if you like, of the period.
What's his wife doing? Is that his wife?
It is. It's his wife sitting on the sofa next to him. She's covering up the figure of a dead child. It's a very unusual feature of this particular painting that they're often family portraits, that's quite common, but I can't think of any others which features a sort of probably recently deceased child who's kept as a memorial, really.
Who's still part of the family?
Yeah, absolutely. But I think what it tells us most is that this is a rising star of the middle classes.
He's writing even as he's being painted.
Not satisfied with taking on challenging medical cases, Robert Miners also wrote about his work.
So the first book that Miners publishes is on amputation. Now, Not only is it one of the most common operations in the 18th century, but there's a lot of publications coming out at this time. But there's also some continuity between the books because they're using the same equipment and essentially the same procedure. When most people are operating, amputating a leg in about 10 seconds, Myners is trying to describe how they might operate more quickly. What I think is important about this text is that he describes a multi-tailed bandage, so a new way of bandaging this wound. And while we might attribute it to Myners, it's actually something he could have easily picked up in the General Hospital in Birmingham from other surgical colleagues. So in most cases, an 18th century practitioner might have published maybe one book. But 2 years later, Myners publishes another book on trepanning. So essentially drilling a hole in the head, a very ancient operation that might have been performed if somebody was suffering from, say, epilepsy or severe headaches. In this case, he's actually treating a patient who suffered a fractured skull, and he's simply trying to alleviate the pressure on the brain. But at the same time, save the skin on the scalp and better close the wound, because I think that was one of the main concerns of surgeons at this time, how to close the wound, whether it was caused by a surgeon's knife or an enemy's sword.
Myners was a great reader of other people's experiments, and he kept up to date, didn't he?
Yeah, I mean, he's a technocrat, a craftsman, I don't know, but he reflects this kind of, skill with the hands. It's not all about the brain, it's about practical application, and that is, that is a very Enlightenment idea.
You would want to submit to an operation without anaesthetic to somebody you felt knew what they were doing.
Precisely, and I think for something like the removal of a limb, you wanted someone...
trained on the job.
Absolutely.
Robert Myners continued to share, teach and collaborate, training up his own assistant surgeons as he was trained. He died in 1806, not on the operating table, but after a sudden and violent attack of gout. Who knows how many lives he saved in over 40 years of surgery. He was a brave and skillful man. These achievements and the progress from the 18th century still echo today.
I like to see Birmingham as part of the West Midlands, as a kind of Silicon Valley in the mid and late 18th century, a pushing forward of the boundaries between knowledge and the real world.
It's that eclectic mix that's going on from the late 17th century, throughout the long 18th century, into the early 19th century, that varied mix of industrialists, bankers, thinkers, medical people, who were all overlapping with each other and were not compartmentalised like we are today.
It's almost impossible to imagine the lives of these 18th century men, John Baskerville, Josiah Wedgwood and Robert Myners. The way they lived, their attitudes, their beliefs. But what we can share in, and what I find very attractive, is their energy and enthusiasm. Their willingness to constantly experiment, to improve, to make what they did better.